where she actually is, and then she gets busted out of there. So it's a very.
Was it reversible in any way? Was
Wait,
it?
this guy actually.
It's in her case. I'm not exactly sure. She went on to have a little bit of a career, but she eventually attempted to commit suicide later again. That was unsuccessful. Then
Yo.
her and several of the victims of Ewan Cameron's experiments in the 1980s, they ended up suing the CIA for supporting Ewan Cameron. And during those lawsuits,
God.
the attorneys who were representing them, they took the depositions of several of the people who were involved in MK Ultra to try to use this during their trial. So they took the depositions of Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, and many of the victims who were victims of all this. And that's basically the basis for my book. I found thousands of pages of these depositions. That's just verbatim transcript of these people talking about either what they did or what was done to them. And so I'm using that throughout the book to explain, here's what they're doing in their own words, or here's what was done to them in their own words.
Wow. Well, so what was the result of the trial?
Oh, well, so it was actually settled out of court before it went to trial. So the plaintiffs, the CIA gave the plaintiffs $750,000 to be split among them. But after attorney's fees and everything, it doesn't really amount to much anyway. And so, they settled out of court. They got a little bit of money, but they never went to trial. And so these depositions, though, since it never went to trial, these were just in the papers of Joseph Rao, who's the main lawyer who was involved in this case. And when he passed away, his papers were donated to the Library of Congress that had all these thousands of pages of depositions in there, 823 pages of which were Sidney Gottlieb testifying about what he did in MK Ultra. And so I was rooting around the Library of Congress and happened to find
It's been so long. Oh my god.
found basically the basis for what this book is.
Wow. Wow. I wonder how much of that woman's psychological breakdown had to do
This
with
is so long,
the guilt
bro.
of performing those experiments on people and realizing that it wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
He thought it was going to do. In fact, it was destroying people's minds.
Yeah, maybe some. I
No,
mean, it's
don't.
speculation
Please.
because I'm not sure. Or that had to have been unconscious. There's in what was called the sleep room, Ewan Cameron's sleep room. This is where they would do the chemical comas. One of the nurses, I have kind of her diary entries basically describing what she was seeing, and she does seem to be pretty reluctant to have done what she was actually doing. And Ewan Cameron, she said, would often come over to her and pat her on the back and say, you're helping these people, just trying to coax her along to go along with what he was telling her to do.
Ewan Cameron seems like a complete madman. Like he was, it almost like too good to be true. Not too good, but too like mad scientist to be true. Was he on any sort of drugs?
I mean, I've never seen anything to indicate that he was on drugs, but he definitely had almost like a messiah complex. He thought, I'm going to be the one to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine because I'm going to cure all mental illness through this psychic driving or whatever it was. He was going to be the next Sigmund Freud. He really had delusions of grandeur, just like I think Jolly West did as well. And so I think that drove a lot of what he was doing. His patients were just a means to his own end. They're the guinea pigs that I can use to prove that these medical techniques actually work, and therefore everyone's going to praise me because I've cured, schizophrenia or whatever it is.
I'm just always suspicious of something that someone has that kind of access to all sorts of compounds, and then you're experimenting on people, and especially with things like amphetamines, which do tend to make people a little less empathetic, a little more driven. I would be very curious to see if he was interested in anything like that.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically for him in that case. Many of the people who are either running the sub-projects or approving them, like Sidney Gottlieb took a lot of LSD. He was, when the CIA got LSD, before it gave it to other people, the first thing they did was try it for themselves to see what actually happened. So Sidney Gottlieb took it multiple times before he ever even gave it to people to understand what it was like.
Wow.
And, one of the physician who was the attending physician the first time he took LSD, because they did it in kind of a controlled setting with several other people there, a guy named Harold Abramson. And for anyone listening who knows much about the Frank Olson incident, Frank Olson is a guy that would later be dosed with LSD. He would go out the hotel window in New York, and Harold Abramson is the guy who Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook, they took to New York to get treatment from Harold Abramson afterwards. So he had this CIA connection.
Wow. The reason why I brought up amphetamines is because I feel like it might be one of the unheralded or undiscussed drivers in a lot of like psychopathic behavior that we see in our culture today. I think there's a lot of people on prescribed amphetamines that operate in a way that is very, very much like a functional meth head.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And I would wonder, like, if you were in charge of doing something this evil, just running experiments where you're destroying people's minds and you're getting no positive results. None of it's working, yet you continue to do it. And you even do it to people that used to be involved in the program with that poor woman. Like, what's the psychological profile of that guy? Because he's obviously mentally ill, which is fascinating, right? It's fascinating that a mentally ill person is working on a mind experiment program. Because there's no way he's not mentally ill. Like, to have no empathy to these people that you've tried all this stuff on, and not only has it not been effective and not rid them of mental illness, it's made them far worse.
Yeah, for Ewan Cameron, he I feel like he definitely lacked empathy, whether that's some kind of medical thing or whatever. There are a couple people in the book, I think, who are like that. One of them is Ewan Cameron. Another is George White, who is in charge of Operation Midnight Climax. He was in it just for the fun of it. He would dose his own friends with LSD just to see what would happen. You know, there's one story in the book. There was a woman who had gone over to a dinner party, basically. She had actually gone over with her husband a few weeks before, but George White didn't dose them because the husband was there. The husband went away on a business trip, so the woman and her friend, they ended up going to see George White to hang out. And White dosed them with LSD. The woman had her 1-year-old son there with her, but he still dosed them with LSD. She ends up basically going crazy. I mean, she goes home. She ends up calling, George White, asking, "What's happened to me? What's going on?" One of these women, she ended up being committed to a mental institution for basically the rest of her life after this happened to her. So she had some kind of like psychotic break after this unwitting, surreptitious dose of LSD. Of course, she didn't know what was going on, so she thought her whole world was collapsing. Yeah, she lost her husband. It was said that she would cower in the corner of her parents', house before she went to this mental institution, convinced that an unidentified they was like looking after her, trying to get her, calling on the phone. None of this was happening, but she was just having these delusions that someone was out to get her. That's kind of a recurring theme that you see in these people who are unwittingly dosed. One of the saddest stories in the book is a guy named Wayne Ritchie, and George White did the same thing to him. But Wayne Ritchie he was a guard at Alcatraz for a while. This is in San Francisco. And he had gone to a Christmas party at the post office there in San Francisco, just for, he was a U.S. Marshal too, so just the U.S. Marshals, whatever. And that night, he was drinking, some of the punch at this party, and he started feeling very strange. He started seeing colors. The room started spinning around him. He ended up going upstairs to where his locker was and, getting his things, and he wound up going home because he didn't, know what was going on. When he got home, his girlfriend was upset at him. She said that, "I'm not happy here. I want to move to New York." And so when he's in this fog, he decides, "I know how to set my life on track. I'm going to grab a couple of my service revolvers. I'm going to go to a bar downtown. I'm going to rob it, and I'm going to give the money to my girlfriend so she can go to New York and she'll be happy, and so she won't break up with me." So when he's in this fog, he ends up doing all this. He gets his revolvers. He goes to a bar downtown. He basically has a stick up, give me all the money in the till. A quick thinking patron who's sitting next to him basically gets the mug of beer and smashes it over his head so he falls down. The cops come later, they arrest him, he's in jail. After a day or two, he kind of sobers up and kind of awakens from this fog, and he doesn't know what happened to him at that point. He ends up losing his job, losing his friends. For the next 30, 40 years, he doesn't know what happened until in 1999, he was reading the Washington Post, and he saw an article describing MKUltra, and two things in particular stuck out to him. One was George White, whom he knew back in the days when he was a U.S. Marshal, and the other one was a description of LSD. And so Wayne Ritchie starts putting all this together and thinking, I think George White gave me LSD that night at the holiday party and spiked the punch bowl, and that's what happened. And it turns out, you can see in this book, in the photo section, the last photo in the photo section of my book, it's a image of George White's diary from the day that Wayne Ritchie went insane, and it says Federal Building Christmas party. So he was there at the Christmas party.
Wow. Imagine being that guy reading that article 30 years later and realizing this guy ruined my life for fun.
Yeah. So he ended up suing the CIA, but the judge said that he couldn't prove that he had been dosed with drugs, so he couldn't prove in his favor. And so, there are dozens of stories like
fucking
that.
psycho.
Yeah.
What a fucking psycho.
So he's
dosing up the punch bowl, ruining lives.
And he knows how messed up it is, because by that point he had done this to multiple people and caused them to lose a lot, you know. So he knew what he was doing at that point.
This is just what happens to people when they have that kind of unchecked power, no oversight. Yeah, and they're the kind of psychopaths that would be involved in this sort of experimentation.
Oh my god, that's hard.
Yeah, no, so
Wait,
I
that's
think he's
actually
probably the most
hard.
heinous of the
How is this
individuals in
harder
this
than
book.
diamond?
All of them are to a degree. Sidney Gottlieb, I think I don't think he's as heinous in the sense that he's like intentionally trying to harm people. He thinks he's doing this for a patriotic reason. He thinks MK
That
Ultra
shit
is
up
actually
there
going
is
to help us defend
invisible.
ourselves against the Soviet Union. There is some like moral justification, at least he
Love
has for
Stalin.
himself, so it's not all just whatever George White is doing. But at the same time, Sidney Gottlieb doesn't really take any responsibility for what happens to these people. Basically, the way that MK Ultra was structured with these sub-projects, Sidney Gottlieb wasn't running these experiments himself. What he would do is he would fund other people to do experiments. And most of the time, these people were experts in their own field. So they were like reputable people. Ewan Cameron was the head
about
of the
right.
American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. He was like the most famous psychiatrist in the world, and he was being funded by this. So Sidney Gottlieb thought, well,
Okay,
if I
after
can
this
fund
song.
reputable psychiatrists or drug researchers to do these experiments, then it's up to them to provide the safety and the procedures, you know, to keep these patients safe. It's not my job. They're the ones who are conducting the experiments. That's how he justified it to himself. But that's how the structure of MK Ultra typically works.
Such a diffusion responsibility.
Exactly. Gottlieb is funding people, and he's not even funding them directly. In most cases, what's happening is he's using cutout organizations. So he's giving the money to one of them's called the Getchiker Fund, one of them's called the National Institute of Mental Health, and then the CIA sets up its own cutout organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which is just a made-up organization. But so the CIA would transfer the funds to the society, who would then transfer it to the researcher. In many cases, the researchers didn't even know they were being funded by the CIA. They just thought, oh, I got a grant from this organization, that's great. So they don't even know that their true patron is Sidney Gottlieb and MK Ultra. They just know, oh, they want me to do these experiments, and in many cases, they're allowed to still publish their work. You know, so they're publishing this. Nothing's changed that much from what they were doing before. But it turns out
I did not hear
the
that.
CIA who wants to make sure they continue doing these experiments just in case they find something that could be a reach.
I hope I poop it again.
What was your journey personally like, with both researching these subjects and then writing books about it? Because what was your opinion on all these things before this, and how much of it shaped your worldview?
So with probably the first book is more formative to the shaping of my worldview, just because that was the first one I did. So
What was your perspective before getting involved in any of this material?
well, I'm pretty much I would consider myself a skeptic generally, So when stuff gets a little too outlandish, I am pretty skeptical. But of course the existence of MK Ultra, and even in my first book, The Dirty Tricks Department, there are some projects that are even more outlandish than some of the stuff I've been talking about with MK Ultra. And so that kind of lowered my barriers to thinking that, oh, people are crazy. Or like, oh, the government does actually perform these crazy, projects. One of the ones that really lowered my barriers to that for the first book was called Operation Fantasia. And again, it's just a testament to the absurdity of some of the ideas that were happening in World War II and within the intelligence community. Operation Fantasia was the brainchild of this guy named Ed Salinger, and he had been a businessman who had done imports and exports in Tokyo, so he knew Japanese culture, he knew the language, he knew the religious beliefs. The OSS wanted to exploit that by trying to find a way we can demoralize the Japanese. You know a lot about the Japanese psyche, the idea was, Ed Salinger, so figure out a way we can demoralize the Japanese and make them basically give up this war, because, they're dug in, they're not giving up. We need to find a way that we can basically use psychological warfare on them. So his idea is that in the Shinto religion, there are these kind of mystical figures called kitsune, and in many cases they take the form of like a fox, a glowing fox, and oftentimes they represent portents of doom. So if you see one of these kitsune, it's an indication that something bad is about to happen.
Poignant.
And so Salinger knew, what if we can artificially create kitsune, spread them around Japan, then all these Japanese soldiers are going to see them and think, oh, that's a portent of doom, surely it means we're going to lose the war, therefore we might as well lay down our arms right now. And so Salinger, initially his idea is we're going to create whistles that can make fox sounds, and we're going to distribute them across Japan to our agents there, and they can blow these whistles like anyone would recognize a fox sound. He had the idea that we're going to create artificial fox odors and spread it around places, and people are going to think that it's the kitsune foxes that are walking around. None of those ever materialized, but then he thought, what if we actually do it? What if we capture foxes from China and Australia, we paint them with glowing radioactive paint, and then we drop them in Japan? Surely that's going to scare the Japanese. So there are actually several experiments that they did this. So they captured foxes. The United States Radium Corporation produced a paint with radium, with radioactive.
So lume from dials of watches.
Exactly, it's the same kind of thing. It glowed enough. So they decided we're going to paint foxes with this, but they first needed to test whether it's possible to paint fur with this and it stay on. So they went to the Central Park Zoo and they got a raccoon and they painted it and kept it under lock and key. And it turns out after a few days of ordinary raccoon shenanigans, the paint stayed on. So they thought, okay, this might have something going for it.
Oh, okay.
So then
not that hard, I guess.
We're going to paint these foxes, throw them out into the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and throw them overboard to see if they can actually swim to shore. Because if we're going to get these foxes to Japan, we're going to have to throw them off the coast, and they're going to have to swim, then scare people. But can foxes even swim? He didn't know. So he gets these foxes, he paints them with this paint, he throws them in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and it turns out they actually swam to shore, so that worked. However, by the time they had gotten to shore, the paint had all washed off. And
so they poisoned the water.
And so it's like, well, if we were to do this in Japan, the paint's you see a fox, it's not a kitsune, it has to be a glowing fox. Right. And so he decided, well, that's not going to work. So his next plan, this is one of the craziest things I found for my first one. The next plan was, we are going to stuff a fox, a dead fox, just taxiderm it, have this fox body, we're going to paint it with this glowing paint, we can drape a cloth over it and paint glowing bones on it to make it look like a skeleton, and we're going to put a human skull over this fox head to make it look as if it's a human skull, because apparently this was like an even more potent version of the kitsune myth that was going around in Japan. So we're going to put this human skull on this taxidermied glowing fox. We're going to have the jaw open and close as if it's talking, and we're going to blast propaganda out of the skull, and we're going to attach balloons to it so that it can fly over Japan. The Japanese are going to look up and see this flying, glowing, radioactive fox spreading this propaganda, and they're apparently going to lay down their arms. I guess that was the plan. And so that was his ultimate idea of what we can do to defeat the Japanese.
Did they launch that? Did they attempt it?
That never actually made it. About the time that he was writing all this up and doing these experiments, the Manhattan Project had performed the Trinity test, and so it's like, well, we already have the weapon that's going to win the war, so we don't need the glowing foxes. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you research stuff like that, all of a sudden it's like, well, anything is kind of possible.
The problem is most people haven't researched it. So when you're having conversations with people, like I've always been conspiratorially minded, but more in the fun side, like Bigfoot, UFOs, dumb stuff, as a distraction. Like I know what it is. I'm interested because it's silly, and I just find it fun. Like the Bigfoot thing, I watched a Bigfoot documentary the other night against my own better judgment. Now my YouTube algorithm is filled with Bigfoot stories. It's just the dumbest thing ever. But when I started doing the podcast, it slowly shifted my perspective of
what the fuck is
not only are there real conspiracies, but they're way more prevalent than you would ever think. And you almost have to get lucky to find out about them. Like one of the things from the book Chaos was Tom O'Neill describing some of the documents that were discovered in, I believe it was a storage unit where they had some...
like the MK Ultra document?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that story?
Yeah, that's a big part of my book. So in 1975 or so, really in 1974, there's something called the Rockefeller Commission, and that was an executive commission set up to investigate past abuses of the intelligence community. And that kind of led to the Church Committee in 1975, and also the Pike Committee in the House. But after they published their final reports, those reports included things about MK Ultra, that the U.S. government had performed these secret drug experiments in the past, and that led a former State Department employee named John Marks to file a Freedom of Information Act request, basically for any and all documents related to these former drug experiments. And so,
What?
not too long afterwards, this a CIA this guy named Frank Laubinger, he was working in like the CIA archives, but he discovered these 6 or 7 boxes of material that Sidney Gottlieb hadn't destroyed when he retired from the CIA, because Gottlieb incinerated most of his files, and so did Richard Helms. They were in on this together. But it turns out those boxes escaped the destruction because they had been sent to the CIA Record Center several years before Gottlieb and Helms retired. Therefore, they weren't incinerated in this purge, and so they survived. So Marx filed that information request. These boxes were found, and then they were released. And this was right around the time that there were a couple of subcommittee hearings on.
It actually might
that's
be.
right when all these documents came out.
That's by design.
So that's how thousands and thousands of documents related to MK Ultra survived, even though Gottlieb and Helms incinerated most of them.
Which leads you to consider, what would we know if those documents hadn't been discovered?
Yeah,
we would be decades behind on this.
Yeah, they do reveal a lot of information. That said, we can actually kind of run this scenario because we do know what we kind of knew before those documents were released. So before those documents were released, you still had the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee and a few other things. But, so we would have known still, because it came out before those documents, about the Frank Olson incident. This guy was dosed with LSD at this place called Deep Creek, and he ended up going out the window of the Statler Hotel in New York. He died. We would have known about Operation Midnight Climax, even though I don't know if that name was specifically used within these committee publications. So we would have known.
Such a great name.
Well, that's George White's doing.
Is it?
Sidney Gottlieb said he had a flair with a pen. Like he was a journalist before
Fucking
he.
psycho.
Yeah, he was. In fact, while we're on that topic, at the end of Operation Midnight Climax, he wrote a letter to Sidney Gottlieb, basically thanking him for supporting me for all these years. Out of all the MK Ultra sub-projects, a lot of them started in 1953. Many of them were done by 1963, but several continued into the late 60s. But after this was done, he wrote a letter to Sidney Gottlieb, and in the depositions that I found, the attorneys confront Gottlieb about this, and they ask him, what was in that letter? And Gottlieb says, he had a flair for writing, you can't trust anything he said. But what was in it? It turns out what was in it, George White wrote, I toiled in the vineyards wholeheartedly because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the Almighty? So we will we would have known the broad outlines of MK Ultra because that was already released before those files. But the files give us a really detailed view of what happened.
We don't know what was in the file that was doing.
That's correct.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Yeah, we kind of do know a little bit about what was in them because there was an investigation that was done afterwards because it was illegal for them to disclose the files. Nothing even ever happened to them. They didn't face any consequences for it. However, Gottlieb's secretary, this woman who had only been working for him for a few weeks before he retired, he told her to basically incinerate these files. So she didn't know it was against protocol or whatever. She was new to the job. But she was interviewed later as part of the CIA investigation into the destruction of the files.
That's so hard.
And she does say a little bit about what she thinks were in the files. Some of his personal papers, and there was secret and sensitive files in there. We don't really have could be, although I do think a lot of the files were in the depositions that I found. George White, or Sidney Gottlieb says that George White was providing them personal updates about the experiments that he was doing when he was office. And so I'm assuming that a lot of the files consisted of George White's personal reports on what was going on.
Now, when you get deeper and deeper into this stuff, how much has it shaped your worldview?
A decent amount in the sense that this is a bit for kind of the American public in general in the 1970s when this was coming out. It really led people to cast a skeptical eye toward the government and thinking it's just assumed that the government is supposed to be the protector of civil liberties. But after Watergate, after MK Ultra, after the Vietnam War, it starts to seem as if the government is infringing on those civil liberties instead of being the protector of it. In many cases, it's infringing on them. Not that it doesn't protect civil liberties, but one of the main things that I came away after writing this book is the problem problem of oversight. I think the constitutional system of government that we have is ingenious. The fact that we have checks and balances, separation of powers. However, we have to enable separate branches of government to be able to check the other branches. For most of the Cold War, that external check on the executive branch, the Congress checking the executive, the president, or the CIA, didn't really exist. So anytime that the CIA was doing an operation, I have a chapter about this, but sometimes the CIA personnel would try to inform members of Congress of what they were doing. I have one specific quote where a guy walks up to a sitting senator and says, "Hey, let me tell you about what we're doing in Chile or whatever." And then he says, "No, I don't want to hear it. Don't tell me to do what you're going to do." He doesn't even want to know. So it's like, how can you expect Congress to get oversight of the executive if they are completely unwilling to even know what the executive is doing? So fortunately, in the aftermath of these revelations, there have been some programs or committees that set up within Congress to provide that external check. However, it's not too clear how effective those are. For one check on the executive after this is that the president now has to sign off basically on covert operations, so that eliminates the president's plausible deniability. One of the main themes throughout this book is what I call the vicious cycle of secrecy. So an organization like the CIA that has secrecy, that kind of leads to what I see as this vicious cycle. Secrecy leads to plausible deniability, because if it's secret, nobody can know that I'm doing this, therefore, I'm not going to be blamed for it. So secrecy leads to plausible deniability. Plausible deniability leads to reckless behavior, like MK Ultra. If nobody's going to find out what I'm doing, therefore, I'm incentivized to do some crazy stuff because I'm not going to be held accountable. So secrecy to plausible deniability to reckless behavior. Reckless behavior, in many instances, leads to embarrassment. It's almost inevitable for many of these projects that they get found out. Someone leaks something to the press. This is how Family Jewels that the CIA had, that was like a compilation of all the illegal stuff that it had done over the past couple of decades. It eventually got leaked to Seymour Hersh, who published it on the front page of the New York Times. So reckless behavior leads to embarrassment, but embarrassment leads to secrecy, because now that we've been found out, we got to make sure that never happens again. We need more secrecy, and the vicious cycle can continue. So if you can break that vicious cycle by having some kind of external check, that's what you actually need, like an empowered Congress that is willing to check the executive. So,
and then you realize, who's running against them? Who wants that job? Not a lot of impressive people. A lot of really driven, successful, intelligent people are involved in other activities that consume their time. They have families, they have careers, they have a lot. They don't have the desire to be a congressperson. So you're not getting the cream of the crop. You're not even getting anything remotely similar to the cream of the crop. You're occasionally getting great people that really want to serve the country. But that is rare. That is like, I wouldn't say rare, but if 20% of the food you ate at a place was poison, would you go eat at that place? You would not, right? You would say, I'm assuming there's fucking poison in that place. That's Congress.
And,
that's elected officials.
Yeah, and Andrew Yang has made this point before, I'm not sure if I can say it, that the re-election rate of Congress is super high. It's like 80, 90%, whatever.
Yeah.
The approval rating for Congress is like in the teens. So
Yeah.
how is it we have such a divergence between the re-election rate and the approval rating? It has to do with the kind of electoral system. The people who are incentivized to actually run for Congress, in many cases, they're the most ideological on either side, because the only race that matters is actually the primary. Because if you're in a district that is 90% Trump voters, the Republican is going to win the general election. It doesn't matter who it is. So, the primary is the main election that happens in those districts. And if that's the case, well, the person who can win the primary is going to win the general. And who's going to win the primary? Well, it's going to be the person who can get 90% of Trump voters to be more interested in them than whoever the other Republican, is.
Right.
In many cases, that drives ideological extremism, because, you're already selecting a sample size of voters within the primary who are the most ideological extreme, and so they're going to elect basically whoever it is, because the general election is a foregone conclusion. So if you can realign the electoral system in a way to where, I don't know the answer to this, but it would be some kind of open primaries or ranked voting or proportional representation, ending gerrymandering, something like that, then you better incentivize Congress people to actually
Practice.
want the job, or incentivize people who would be good at the job to engage in the job, or to become Congress people because they actually have a clear path to doing it, because they're not going to be blocked in the primary. So some kind of reform like that, I think, is how you better facilitate this check between the different branches.
But even then, I don't know if it motivates the cream of the crop. I think most people would rather be on the outside, like most wealthy people that are successful.
Memory
They'd rather
control.
fund a candidate that, suits their needs.
Yeah, well, getting maybe big money out of politics.
That would be wonderful. That would be that would be the single probably biggest help. And then also getting out insider trading out of Congress, make it less like we're finding out that
Look at
people
that hitbox.
are getting $150,000 a year and they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars and there's no investigation whatsoever. Like, what did you do? What did you do? And why are you still working? If you're so good at trading, why are you working for $170,000 a year, which is a great salary? Don't get me wrong.
I'd take it.
Nothing wrong with $170,000 a year, but when you have $400 million,
Yeah.
like you couldn't get me to do a job for $170,000 a year. Like I don't have the time.
You could get me to do it.
Right, but you know what I'm saying? Like you can get Congress people to still show up and do that job. Is it because they care that much about the American people? Well, that doesn't really jive. It doesn't make sense because they seem completely full of shit when they give their speeches and it's all canned and fake and insincere and there's no. You don't have any real connection with their words. So what are they? They're these weird people that have accepted this job that no one wants. It's critically important to the function of our government. And you're getting really dull people that are taking this job.
You try
It's
to be
fascinating.
cataclysmic.
One of the things that also was like so disheartening. I had Rep Luna on the podcast, who was great, and she's very, very interesting. We've mostly been talking about UFOs because that's the thing that she's involved in. But one of the things she said about certain issues is they don't want to solve these issues
Oh, yeah.
because this is how
They
they
run.
Come on
they,
now.
they can fundraise it.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
Like just that trap, I was like, oh no. I didn't want to think that is the case. And she's like, oh, that's it. That's
Yeah.
100% it.
Yeah.
They don't want to fix it.
That makes me even more convinced, though, that a restructuring of the electoral system in a way that eliminates, that incentivizes basically better behavior, whether that's through open primaries, ranked choice voting, whatever.
Yeah.
That has to happen some way, I would think. So.
Well, this should also be some sort of a competency test if someone wants to take that position. Like, if you want to be a lawyer, you have to look at poor Kim Kardashian. She
Why
can't
did I
pass
do
the
that?
bar.
What the fuck?
She's trying so hard. I can't pass the bar. Hard to be a lawyer, right?
I am kind of skeptical of a competency test in a sense, though, because someone has to write them.
Well, not only that, but are you watching them in ChatGPT? And we're living in a weird world right now. It's a very weird world of technology. But it would be nice if you knew that this person was capable of doing the job.
Yeah.
I mean,